Hey, my name's Loz, and today I just wanted to chat to you about grief, loss, and resilience. So, most of us are going to experience the beauty that is grief and loss at some point in our lives if you haven't already experienced it. It manifests itself in different ways for different people. And I liken the state of grief to basically understanding the concept of waves. So grief is not one of those things where you just get over something, especially when it comes to the death of a loved one. If you liken it to going to the beach and, seeing a wave for the first time a wave hits you, you fall over, it smacks you in the face and you nearly drown. The thing about waves, though, is that we know with the pull of gravity and the way that the earth spins, waves are always going to be there. And the more you go to the beach, the more you realise that that's a fact. And you learn to equip yourself with the resilience to be able to stand up against waves. You get better and better, stronger and stronger. And soon you'll be smashing through the waves. Or you'll ride the waves, and you'll take them all the way back to shore, ready to do it again when it hits you next time. That's a pretty specific analogy, but that's how I liken grief and loss. So for those of you who don't know, my first husband, Brian, took his own life in 2016. In fact, it was 2 days after my 31st birthday. It was on a Sunday. He was just a month shy of turning 30, and my family were preparing to come over to have a birthday breakfast. So he was with his family that morning, going on a hike up a big mountain in Boonah, which is a suburb west of here, a beautiful area, beautiful part of southeast Queensland, very scenic, and it was a really, really beautiful day. Now I got a phone call that morning from Brian's mum saying something had happened, that he'd fallen, and I actually thought she was calling me to wish me a happy birthday, but very, very long story short, he actually jumped off a sheer cliff in front of his father and in front of his sister. And I was never to celebrate my birthday, obviously. I ended up driving out with my family to Boonah and I saw his body. And at the time, I think I just switched off all rational parts of my brain. I went into like a fight mode, into a business mode. And the way that I handled my grief basically was to turn everything into processes. So I saw his body, and when I saw his body, Brian wasn't there. The person that he was gone. And that was the first dead body I'd actually seen. A month later, my grandfather, so my father's father, who was one of my biggest inspirations in my life, and one of the people I looked up to the most, he passed away. So he was a lot older, and it was kind of expected considering his age. That was the second time I saw a dead body. And prior to that, I'd never actually lost a person that was close to me in my life. I'd lost some great grandparents and some great aunts and uncles whom I wasn't really that close with, but that was really an absolute catalyst to change when it comes to the trajectory of my life. I'd lost dogs in the past, and since Brian's death, not only have I lost my grandfather, but my own father has become estranged from me. My friends have all become estranged from me, and I had to put one of my dogs to sleep. One of the dogs that I adopted with Brian actually about this time last year. And that was really, really hard because I've never had to do anything like that before. So a couple of things that I've learnt as I've sort of traversed through the terrain that is grief, loss, and resilience, or you could call it suffering if you wanted to, but honestly, it's about building resilience, is that it allows you to actually work out what's important in your life, and it gives you a chance to connect with the past in a way that empowers you to rise up and turn adversity into your greatest advantage And it gives you the capacity to inspire others to do the same, because the truth of the matter is we're all going to have to experience grief or loss at some point in our lives. You know, it might not be the loss of a person, but it might be the loss of something else, an animal or a job or something. And the impermanence of life make that absolutely inevitable. One of my favourite teachings by Dr. John Demartini is where he talks about grief, and he defines grief as one of two things. It's either the loss of that in which you were infatuated with, or the gain of that in which you rejected. And so loss can occur in many ways, and grief obviously is an extension of loss. But I'm here to sort of share my experience of the two and how I've built a very resilient, compelling and inspiring life from those two things. So when Brian died, there were a couple of strategies that I used to sort of move forwards from that and really connect with myself and deep dive into the things that I uncovered. At the time of his death, I was 31, or I just turned 31. I was at a point in my life where I guess you could describe it as only a post-quarter life crisis. Between the ages of 28 and 31, I basically lost my identity. I didn't know who I was anymore. I'd spent the majority of my life living in the footsteps of my father, the person that was one of the biggest people that it was hard to gain the love of, but one of the people that inspired me the most. And something happened. We had a bit of conflict, which turned into his estrangement from me eventually. But we were so similar, and part of me was resisting that because I realized innately that wasn't the person that I was destined to be. The experience of going through the suicide of somebody else, and what makes that really, really hard as opposed to losing somebody from natural causes, when it's somebody taking their own life or when it's an accident, you always want to know why. And I remember I questioned why for a very, very long time. And I think that I went through a very long phase of passive mourning. I thought that I was over my mourning stage, M-O-U-R-N, not morning as in good morning. But I thought I'd gotten over my mourning 18 months after he died. I remarried in 2017 in July. It was a way for me to help move through my grief. I did fall in love with somebody, and Michael is happily married to me still. And I'm happily married to him. But the truth is I didn't get over Brian's death. And I think I only came to terms with that passive mourning stage about 3 weeks ago. So it's been just over 3.5 years since Brian died. And literally something 3 weeks ago, I don't know what it was. Maybe that's just the way that it works. But something happened, and I think I just came to terms with it. And I feel like I hit a point in my life where I could move on. So immediately after Brian's death, I was already seeing a counsellor, or rather a psychologist, and that was definitely a tool for me to help get me through. Having a support network of amazing people, friends and family who helped nurture me and literally keep me alive in the weeks, months after Brian's passing. I can't really express my gratitude as much as I can at its depths of what it means to me. Those people were there for emotional support. They provided me with food. They kept me company, made sure I was safe. But a funny thing happened. After the funeral, they all fucked off. And I'm not being hard, I'm being very brutally honest here. And somebody had sort of said something to me before, and I went and read on a whole heap of forums how to deal with the suicide of a loved one, as you do, bloody Google University. And there was a bit of a trend in people saying, when the funeral's over, people go away because they don't know how to deal with you. All of my friends divorced me over a period of years after Brian's death. I don't think they really understood that I was still grieving, and they told me that I became distant, that our relationships were one way, and that they didn't like the person I'd become. And the reality is, I had my entire life, all of my certainty was robbed from me. It was taken away from me. And when you're in relationships with people and everything's being taken from you, you have nothing else to give when all you can do is take, because you're trying to find meaning in your life. And I'm pretty disappointed with the people that were in my life, the fact that they couldn't understand that. But I do know in my heart of hearts that they only knew what they knew. And I'm sure a lot of them, if I talk to them now, they'd probably say that they wish they'd handled things a little bit differently. And certainly I probably could have been a little more in tune with their needs, but honestly, it's taken me 3.5 years to finally deal with this, honest. So having a support network is really important. Having people that you can speak to in a language where they will just listen is really important. A lot of people talk about, when they lose a loved one, that they get scared about talking to people. And I think it's really important to use a certain language when you are talking about somebody that you've lost. So I tend to find, rather than saying, my husband, if I'm having a conversation with somebody about him or something he's done in the past, I always make it about the person that I'm talking to. So I'll refer to Brian as, your brother or your mate or, your brother-in-law or your son. And I tend to find that helps to put people at ease quite a bit. And it helps them to connect with the part, that is resonating with them at such a deep level, because it is their relationship. It's not about me. A lot of people victimize themselves when it comes to grief. And I was 100% guilty of that. For a very long time, I defined my entire life by the fact that I was a widow. I joined a widows group on Facebook and then subsequently left, because the whole freaking place was just people wallowing in their sadness and not being proactive. So another coping mechanism that I used was a distraction mechanism, which ended up turning out to be really, really cool. So at a point in my life when I hated myself, there was a lot of self-loathing, and Brian committed suicide. I channeled my grief into exploring other parts of my personality. So I tried to do things that were so far out of my comfort zone it wasn't funny, because it's the only way that I knew how to grow. I'm a very type A personality, if you haven't noticed. And I tend to have an all or nothing mentality, which works for me most of the time. Sometimes it doesn't work, but then obviously it does work because it teaches me things about myself that I didn't know. So I threw myself into bikini body sculpting competitions, and since the beginning of 2017, I've done 13 shows, which is a lot. It's a lot of shows. I've subsequently stopped doing shows. I probably will go back. But that really developed a part of my personality. And if it hadn't been for the death of Brian and the loss and the grief that I experienced, I would never have explored or touched that part of myself in a very non-literal way. But I learned a lot about the person that I had the potential to be and have grown into subsequently. Another thing is that I used clothing as a way to connect with the past and the person that I had lost. So people find this quite strange, but I kept a lot of Brian's clothing, most of it actually. And the reason that is it was so important to him and his identity. He loved clothes as an expression of himself, and I knew what went into his clothing when he chose them. I knew how particular he was, and there was no way I was letting that go and just going to like a thrift shop. So I held on to those for a very long time. I gave some away to friends and close friends so that they had a keepsake to remind them of him. But here's something that people find quite weird, is that when I met Michael and we cohabitated together, I had all these clothes and I actually realised they were the same size. So Michael and Brian were the same size. Michael used to be quite overweight. Brian was very fit, but Michael lost weight, and then they became the same size. So same pants and same top size and even same shoe size. That was really weird. But now Michael wears a lot of Brian's clothes, and for him that was quite challenging to begin with, but it meant a lot to me. And now I feel like we've repurposed those with purpose. There's a lot of love, and every time I see Michael in one of Brian's outfits, there's such synergy between the two souls now, and it really makes me feel like I've come home. I was so scared of talking about Brian and connecting with him. I went through this stage where it was so passive, and, I talk about him all the time, and, people would get sick and tired of it. honestly, like, people got sick and tired of me talking about him, but I didn't know how else to deal with it. There was a point straight after his death where, you know, I would use language where it was like he was still here, and then I went through a stage where I talked and talked and talked, and then I started to sense that people got a bit over it because they were like, you should be over this by now, sometime after the funeral. And then I just stopped talking about him, and any triggers would just be a catalyst for extreme emotional responses. So I would cry, I would yell, I would get angry, I would get depressed, and I would put myself in a state of suffering on a regular basis. And I look at that, and it was so unhealthy and it was so unsustainable. So I've hit a point now where I'm so connected with the past and so at ease with all the things I have learned and all the ways that I have grown, that I'm no longer afraid to, you know, like, listen to one of his favorite songs. I have his iPod still, and it's plugged into my car, and sometimes it randomly comes on, and funnily enough, the right song, whether or not it's him sending me signals from, you know, beyond, but always whenever I'm feeling something, it will randomly just play a song if I'm not listening to a podcast, and will always be the right song. So I connect through that, and if I feel like crying, I anchor myself in the moment, and that's fine. I let the tears flow because it's okay to cry. If I feel like smelling him, I will spray his Ralph Lauren Polo cologne in the air, and I'll smell it, and it will remind me of him, and it will be nice. And just the sensation of it hitting my skin, it makes me feel at ease. Or if I want to reminisce, I'll pull out old photos and I won't be frightened anymore. Or I'll listen to videos so I can hear his voice. And I do it from a place of loving kindness. And you never forget the people that have passed, because innately, you know, their effect and their profound existence and how that moves you becomes part of the person that you are. And you move forwards in your life holding deeply a part of the essence of that person forever. I think that's one of the biggest things that I've actually learnt, you know, how to connect with the past, but also be inherently present in everything that it is that I do. And out of this experience, so much has come to fruition. I've realized that I just want to teach and inspire people and help people move through grief and help people become the best versions of themselves. You know, I've challenged myself in ways that I never would have done had I not experienced grief. You know, there's such a magnificence to how empowering grief can be, and we can use all of our senses to engage with these energies that have had such an influence in our lives, because life is all about mastery. It's all about mastery. And what grief and loss do is they build resilience by helping us connect to the things that matter most. Thanks for listening.